generation that had gone before.
The anti-war demonstrators in the United States now took their protest to a new level. Stu Ewan took part in one of the growing number of demonstrations against the war.
The confrontation was very intense. The cops very suddenly had moved in on people and started to crack heads, and they beat people pretty badly. There was a lot of blood, there were a lot of injuries, and all of a sudden people understood themselves as being at odds with the powers that be. That for us was a signal that we needed to come back strong, become more militant.
In trying to stop the war in Vietnam, the demonstrations intensified the war at home.
Yeah, burn the back part, burn the back part. Join the lines, you don't have to go, all you do is say no.
There was a class dimension to the Vietnam protests. To a large extent, it was college kids saying they didn't want to go fight this war, that they didn't see much point in. So the blue-collar kids did. It was one of the uglier things about the Vietnam War, that to what extent it was fought by the less fortunate in the society.
In February and March 1968, television brought another set of horrifying images home to Americans. U.S. soldiers were fighting for their lives from one end of South Vietnam to the other. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon was being overrun. This was the Tet Offensive, a military defeat for the North Vietnamese, but ultimately a political victory. Despite hearing repeatedly that there was light at the end of the tunnel, most Americans came to realize they were not going to win the war in Vietnam anytime soon, if ever. On March the 31st, 1968, with the presidential election just a few months away, an exhausted Lyndon Johnson seemed to come to the same conclusion.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
And I looked at the guys in the bunker with me, and I said, he's getting out. And the other guy said, what do you mean? I said, he's not going to run for president. He's not running anymore. He's getting out. He's the commander-in-chief. And so if he's getting out, what are we doing here?
In America, in 1968, peace and understanding were fast becoming distant memories. As the Vietnam War became the longest war in American history, over 100 college campuses were racked by furious protest. In the spring, many of the nation's cities exploded once again with racial violence, propelled by the terrible events of April the 4th, 1968.
When I heard over the news that Martin Luther King had been shot in Memphis and then seconds later killed in Memphis, it was as if a member of my family had been killed. And it said to me, here's this guy has been going around preaching peace and nonviolence and peaceful resistance, and now someone has shot him dead. And it shattered my belief that we could work these things out in a peaceful way.
It's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in.
That night, Robert Kennedy, the leading candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, announced King's death to a room full of campaign workers. In Kennedy, many Americans, both black and white, saw a man who could turn back the tide of violence. 2 months after the death of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy was killed.
My wife came into the bedroom and said, you know what they've done now? They've shot Bobby Kennedy. This they, a sort of paranoid moment of our own, but the sense of everything coming undone.
And you never quite get over it. You no longer feel safe in your life the way you did as a child when your parents were alive. In those turbulent days, you felt you never really will be safe.
Will the convention be in order?
In late August, the city of Chicago was the host city for the Democratic National Convention.
Will the convention be, will the sergeant at arms enforce order in the convention?
Delegates from all 50 states arrived to find Chicago an armed camp. The city's mayor, Richard Daley, knew that tens of thousands of young demonstrators were also on their way.
They're here as guests of the Democratic Party, and let them conduct themselves accordingly.
They were determined to have their say.
All across the country, the new left was trying to provoke people into actions that would escalate the whole thing. You never saw people so provoked in all your life as those Chicago police. The things those kids said to them.
I take one look at these pigs out here and I know what America's about.
The gestures they made to them, deliberately designed to bring on this reaction.
Volunteered to go to the Democratic Convention because I wanted to see it. I can remember up at 2 in the morning trying to get to sleep. It was a little difficult because our windows were open, it was very hot, and all we could hear was the chant, F.U. Dale Lee. It was quite an event. The Democratic Party is coming apart right there in the streets of Chicago.
It seemed to many the country itself was coming apart. In November, America elected a new president who promised to heal the nation's wounds. Richard Milhous Nixon.
We're gonna sock it to him from now.
Just as American unity and confidence seem to be crumbling, a man from Ohio lands on the moon. We'll see that on the next episode of The Century, America's Time. Thank you for joining us. I'm Peter Jennings.